Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. This video is on the reading by Confucius, and it is entitled The Doctrine of the Mean. So this is part 4 of the book, the fourth fundamental question: what should I do and who should I be? So Confucius has some suggestions for that, and I think it'll be easiest if I start with the discussion questions on page 411, and I'm going to start with discussion question 3, and then I'll come back to 1 and 2 after I go through the rest of them, starting with 3. So explain the nature of harmony and equilibrium as discussed in the beginning of the doctrine of the mean. So that is on page 399. The second, or I'll start with the second paragraph because I'll be coming back to this point. So he says, "There's nothing more visible than what is secret, and nothing more manifest than what is minute. Therefore the superior man is watchful over himself when he is alone." So I think that means he's a superior man, and that's what Confucius will talk a lot about, this model of the ideal human behavior. How does the superior man act? And nothing is more manifest than what is minute. So if he's watching himself, even when he's alone, you might have the seed of a desire, and if you're watching for it, you can be aware of the consequences before it gets out of control. Then he says on the next paragraph, this is where he talks about equilibrium and harmony. "While there are no stirrings of pleasure, anger, sorrow, or joy, the mind may be said to be in the state of equilibrium. When those feelings have been stirred and they act in their due degree, there ensues what may be called the state of harmony. This equilibrium is the great root from which grow all the human actings in the world, and this harmony is the universal path which they all should pursue." So there's originally equilibrium where the pairs of opposites are not manifest. So they're all sort of canceling each other out by being in union. When they do manifest and they break out, and he says, in the beginning here, no stirrings of pleasure, anger, sorrow, or joy. So when you start to feel one side of a polarity, you're inevitably going to feel the other. And when you can harmonize those properly, that's called harmony. So putting this in a cosmological framework that the Hindus presented in the Katha Upanishad, equilibrium would kind of be like Brahman, where nothing is manifested in an individuated way yet. It's the ocean of potential being, so all potentials are united there. There's equilibrium. Then when they do manifest in the Atman side of individuality, then you need to harmonize all the different manifestations. So, and how do you harmonize them? He'll go on to talk about the superior man here on page 399, just a little bit down. The superior man embodies the course of the mean. So the mean between two extremes is what he's talking about. Then he uses, the translator uses a pun on words here. The mean man acts contrary to the course of the mean. So the mean man meaning the inferior man. If the superior man's embodying the course of the mean is because he is a superior man. Then the next paragraph. "The master said, 'Perfect is the virtue which is according to the mean. Rare have they long been among the people who could practice it.' The master said, 'I know how it is that the path of the mean is not walked in. The knowing go beyond it, and the stupid do not come up to it.'" So I'm going to skip a little bit down. He's talking about Master Shun. "He took hold of their two extremes, determined the mean, and employed it in his government of the people." So it's the same lesson that Buddha gave in the previous essay that we read about the Four Noble Truths, and the mean between the path of pleasure and the path of extreme self-torture, self-mortification, renunciation to the point of near death. So don't go on either one of those extremes on the path towards nirvana. walk the middle path, and that is what Confucius is talking about here, although he doesn't emphasize that. It's called the doctrine of the mean, but the rest of the essay here does not focus in on that, at least not explicitly. It's mentioned again once later. But let's continue with the discussion questions on page 412. Discussion question 4. Explain what the 5 duties of universal obligation are and the 3 virtues from the middle of the selection. So the 5 duties of universal obligation. If you look at the bottom of page 403, he says, the duties of universal obligation are 5, and the virtues wherewith they are practiced are 3. The duties are those between 1, a sovereign and minister, between father and son, between husband and wife, between elder brother and younger, and those belonging to the intercourse of friends. So there you go, it's relationships. The highest of the relationships is the sovereign and minister, then father and son, then husband and wife, then elder brother and younger, and then friends. Those 5 are the duties of universal obligation: knowledge, magnanimity, and energy. These 3 are the virtues universally binding. And the means by which they carry the duties into practice is singleness. So that concept of singleness will come up again for the next discussion question. Well, what does he mean here by these 3 virtues? Knowledge, magnanimity, and energy. I can see what knowledge means, and even magnanimity, but so at any rate, there's a little bit of elaboration in the second paragraph on page 404. The master said, to be fond of learning is to be near to knowledge. That was the first virtue. To practice with vigor is to be near to magnanimity. To possess the feeling of shame is to be near to energy. That was the one that I don't see the exact correlation there, but at any rate, that's the way they translated it. So what about this, the means by which you can carry these 3 virtues in such a way that you can fulfill the 5 universal obligations, he says, is singleness, the very last word on page 403. He mentions that word again on page 405, the second paragraph, or the first full paragraph. He says, all who have the government of the kingdom with its states and families have the above 9 standard rules, and the means by which they are carried into practice is singleness. So again, all these obligations that we have to our family members and society, the way that they can be fulfilled is through singleness. I would assume that means singleness of mind, singleness of purpose, and it's related to his concept of sincerity, which is the ultimate virtue. If you look on page 412, discussion question 5, the last discussion question. Why is sincerity such an important concept? All right, so we've been talking about singleness. Singleness is an important concept because it's the only way you can fulfill your universal obligations. And we'll see how it's related to sincerity and Confucius's concept of what is good, which is reminiscent of Plato's cave allegory. The idea of the good is the ultimate source of everything in the intellectual world and in the material world, which is a shadow of the absolute ideas in the eternal intellectual world. So continuing here on page 405, so the way to carry these 9 standard rules is singleness. And then he goes on to say, in all things, success depends on previous preparation. All right, then he'll explain how preparing in advance is a key to success. The next paragraph, going down about 5 lines, he says, there is a way to being obedient to one's parents. So there's a whole list of connections here, so I guess I should start at the top of that paragraph, in the middle of page 405. When those in inferior situations do not obtain the confidence of the sovereign, they cannot succeed in governing the people. There is a way to obtain the confidence of the sovereign. If one is not trusted by his friends, he will not get the confidence of his sovereign. There is a way to being trusted by one's friends. If one is not obedient to his parents, he will not be true to his friends. There is a way to being obedient to one's parents. If one, on turning his thoughts in upon himself, finds a want of sincerity, he will not be obedient to his parents. There is a way to the attainment of sincerity in oneself. If a man do not understand what is good, he will not attain sincerity in himself. Sincerity is the way of heaven. The attainment of sincerity is the way of men. He who possesses sincerity is he who, without an effort, hits what is right, and apprehends without the exercise of thought. He is the sage who naturally and easily embodies the right way. He who attains to sincerity is he who chooses what is good and firmly holds it fast. To this attainment there are requisite the extensive study of what is good, accurate inquiry about it, careful reflection on it, the clear discrimination of it, and the earnest practice of it. And he goes on to say, he will not intermit his labors to learn what is the good until he's succeeded, because knowledge of what is good, extensive knowledge of what is good, is required to have sincerity. And if you don't have sincerity, you cannot be obedient to your parents. And if you're not obedient to your parents, you can't be good to your friends. If you're not good to your friends, your sovereign won't trust you. If your sovereign doesn't trust you, you have no influence over the people. So you need to have this singleness of purpose in studying what is good in order to achieve sincerity, which is the key to fulfilling all of your universal obligations to everyone in society. If you go on page 406, he continues to talk about sincerity here. The second full paragraph. He says, when we have intelligence resulting from sincerity, this condition is to be ascribed to nature. When we have sincerity resulting from intelligence, this condition is to be ascribed to instruction. But given the sincerity, and there shall be the intelligence. Given the intelligence, and there shall be the sincerity. It is only he who is possessed of the utmost, of the most complete sincerity that can exist under heaven, who can give its full development to its nature. Able to give its full development to his own nature, he can do the same to the nature of other men. Able to give its full development to the nature of other men, he can give their full development to the nature of animals and things. If he can do that, he can assist the transforming and nourishing powers of heaven and earth. Able to assist those powers of heaven and earth, he may with heaven and earth form a turnion, so kind of a trinity. So now you're seeing the completely sincere, sagely person forms a kind of a trinity with heaven and earth, and is able to bring his own development to fullness, but also other people around him, even the animals and nature. So now it's getting supernatural. This is why sincerity is so important. This is the final discussion question. So continuing, he says, next to the above is he who cultivates to the utmost the shoots of goodness in him. From those he can attain to the possession of sincerity. This sincerity becomes apparent. From being apparent, it becomes manifest. From being manifest, it becomes brilliant. Brilliant, it affects others. Affecting others, they are changed by it. Changed by it, they are transformed. It is only he who is possessed of the most complete sincerity that can exist under heaven who can transform. And then he goes on to say, someone with true sincerity is able to foreknow the future, because they'll understand the omens that happen with the tortoise and the milfoil and the limbs, certain twitching of limbs and there's all different ways by someone who's in tune with nature and heaven can foreknow the future and start to have an effect on ever-widening circles of people and animals in nature through this sincerity. And there's this brilliance that comes about. If you look at the bottom, well, let me just read here, continuing here on page 406. Sincerity is that whereby self-completion is effected, and its way is that by which man must direct himself. Sincerity is the end and beginning of things. Without sincerity, there would be nothing. On this account, the superior man regards the attainment of sincerity as the most excellent thing. Someone who can have sincerity can complete everyone, make everyone, bring them to their fullest potential. At the very bottom of page 406, evidencing itself, it reaches far. Reaching far, it becomes large and substantial. Large and substantial, it becomes high and brilliant. So I'm going to continue to read over on page 407, but notice now we're seeing here that sincerity and knowledge of what is good are linked to the idea of singleness, and it's also linked to this now cosmological principle that is high and brilliant. And so this brings me back to the comparison I made with Plato's idea of the good in the cave allegory. The sun outside of the cave is like, or the fire in the cave is a shadow or a facsimile of the sun outside of the cave, and the sun is itself a shadow of the idea of the good, the ultimate eternal archetype of the sun, from which all of the eternal ideas radiate and all of their shadows. So the idea of the perfect tree is contained in the idea of the good, and all of the three-dimensional trees that radiate from that idea of tree, they're ultimately coming out of the idea of the good too. So if you were to turn the eye of the soul inward to see the idea of the good from which everything emanates, then you would see your connection with everything in the universe, and it seems more plausible from that perspective that you begin to have an effect on nature, the way Confucius is talking about someone with sincerity has this effect over nature. And then he's starting to explain the idea of sincerity in a cosmological way, which I'll then go back and compare to the Taoist cosmology, for example, and a little bit from the Katha Upanishad. But let me continue on the bottom of page 406 over to page 407. He says, evidencing itself, it reaches far. Reaching far, it becomes large and substantial. Large and substantial, it becomes high and brilliant. Large and substantial, this is how it contains all things. High and brilliant, this is how it overspreads all things. Reaching far and continuing long, this is how it perfects all things. Going on, he says, so far reaching and long continuing, it makes him infinite. You know, someone who perceives this high and brilliant essence of sincerity. Continuing here, skipping down to the middle of page 407, the heaven now before us is only this bright, shining spot. When viewed in its inexhaustible extent, the sun, moon, stars, and constellations of the zodiac are suspended in it, and all things are overspread by it. So, I compared Plato's idea of the good to the cosmological concept of a gravitational singularity, a point of infinite density from which the entire universe emerges. Plato says the idea of the good is the source of light, intellectual light, and the source of visible light. So if the singularity is the source of all visible light, according to Plato's cave allegory, it would also be the source of intellect. So if you look at it that way and interpret what Confucius is saying here, it makes sense when he talks about you have to have singleness to fulfill your universal obligations. A singleness comes about, which seems to be synonymous with the idea of sincerity, through studying what is good to its complete extent. What is goodness? Then you will have this singleness, this sincerity of mind, by which you'll then come to see that the heaven now before us is only this bright, shining spot. So according to cosmology, the Big Bang cosmology, the universe is now expanding. In the distant past, it was all contained in a single point of infinite density. That's a controversial topic because a point of zero volume and infinite density is outside of space and time. A lot of physicists don't like that idea, but that's what the math of general relativity describes. And then it expands into the universe, but it's also located at each point of the encompassing sphere. Space is expanding faster and faster until it reaches the speed of light. At each point of the surrounding sphere of the universe, the entire universe is contained in a single point. And this is very similar to what Confucius is saying. The heaven now before us is only this bright shining spot, but when viewed in its inexhaustible extent, the sun, moon, stars, and constellations of the zodiac are suspended in it, and all things are overspread by it. That's very similar to the cosmology of the singularity. So I want to compare that to some of the Taoist texts. So page 256, And this is the writings of Zhuangzi. The top of page 256, he says, and then I'll go to another paragraph at the bottom of 256, this view is the same as that view is the same as this, but that view involves both the right and the wrong, and this view involves also a right and a wrong. Are there indeed or are there not the two views, that and this? They have not found their point of correspondency, which is called the pivot of the Tao. As soon as one finds this pivot, he stands in the center of the ring of thought, where he can respond without end to the changing views, without end to those affirming, without end to those denying. Therefore, I said, there is nothing like the proper light of the mind. And then lower, the next, skipping a paragraph, when he's talking about the light of the Tao, the actual light, he says, it was separation that led to completion. From completion ensued dissolution, but all things, without regard to their completion and dissolution, may again be comprehended in their unity. It is only the far-reaching in thought who know how to comprehend them in this unity. This being so, let us give up our devotion to our own views and occupy ourselves with the views of the ordinary. All right, so the far-reaching, the idea of far-reaching comprehension and unity is what Confucius is talking about. This whole heaven is only this one single spot. Everything is unified in one bright, shining spot. If you look at the Tao Te Ching on page 166, and this is the last I'll compare of this cosmology of this luminous one, but he says, verse 25.3, he says, being great implies reaching out in space. Reaching out in space implies far-reaching. Far-reaching implies reversion to the original point. So that, and then he says, therefore Tao is great, the heaven is great, the earth is great, the king is also great. There are the great four in the universe. So that's very similar to what Confucius is saying here on page 407. You know, reaching out, far-reaching. At the bottom of 4.6, he says, evidencing itself, it reaches far. Reaching far, it becomes large and substantial. Large and substantial, it becomes high and brilliant. And then over on 407, the heaven now before us is only this bright, shining spot. But when viewed in its inexhaustible extent, the constellations of the zodiac are suspended in it, and all things are overspread by it. It's the same idea of this original point, which becomes the overspreading, encompassing horizon of the cosmos. To become aware of that within oneself is to know what is good, and it gives you sincerity and it gives you singleness. And with that knowledge, according to Confucius, you can then fulfill your universal obligations. And that is why sincerity is such an important concept, and that's the answer, or at least plenty of fuel for thought for discussion question 5 on page 412. So now going back to discussion questions 1 and 2 on page 411, compare the view here from Confucius with the ideas of Jainism and Buddhism. What are some of the similarities and differences? Explain. Well, there's the idea of controlling your senses is similar in all of them. Don't let your physical bodily desires stray you from the path of knowledge of what is good. Confucius is very similar to Buddha's recommendation of the golden mean between the two extremes of vulgar pleasure and self-mortification. We saw the part in the very beginning for which this whole reading is entitled The Doctrine of the Mean, at the bottom of page 399. Jainism does not embrace so much of the doctrine of the mean. It takes an extreme stance on ahimsa, or nonviolence. You don't see that, even the Jains were accusing the Buddhists of being too reckless with their using water for their toiletry purposes without properly straining it and everything like that. So there's one difference. Buddhism and Jainism both talk about reincarnation. Buddhism doesn't talk about the individual soul, or rather rejects that concept. Jainism says there is a self. So there is an individual soul, but there's no mention of a personal God. Confucius does mention God once on page 403 near the top. He says, by the ceremonies of the sacrifices to heaven and earth they served God, and by the ceremonies of the ancestral temple they sacrificed to their ancestors. But there's no heavy emphasis on a personal God. There's no mention of reincarnation or an afterlife, although there is ceremonies for the ancestors, which implies there's some kind of an afterlife, but it's not emphasized. But something that is similar for the Buddhists is you can achieve the state, this immortal state of mind, although they don't believe in an immortal individual self. There is an everlasting state of being which wouldn't be able to be expressed with words, that they call it nirvana. Confucius implies there's such a thing that if you focus on what is good, you achieve sincerity, and then you have this supernatural influence over everything that's around you. And the way Buddha talked to his 5 brethren who he returned to after he left them for their self-mortifying practices, he said he had supernatural faculties, transcendent faculties. You know, he has transcended the natural forces and had surpassed them. Okay, so discussion question 2, page 411. How does Confucius's view differ from the Hindu view in the Bhagavad Gita? Explain. All right, so there's a lot of similarities, but the question is, how do they differ? And so the same reason it differs from Buddhism, there's no mention of reincarnation by Confucius. And there's no overt devotion to a personal God, although there is mention of God, I said, as I pointed out, at the top of page 403. He mentions God, but certainly not to the extent that Krishna, who claims to be God, recommends devotion to God as the key to success. For Confucius, the key is sincerity, which is had by studying with a singleness of mind what is good. Now you could say, well, what is good is Krishna, if you're a Hindu, and so you could easily translate the one to the other, but Confucius does not express in any explicit way that what is good is a personal, self-aware, individual, yet omnipresent God. So that's the biggest difference between the two. Other than that, there's more similarities, such as achieving tranquility of the mind through harmonizing your, not being carried away by the pairs of opposites. But that wasn't part of the discussion question. So that will be it for Confucius. And the next reading that I'll make a video for is Plato's dialogue Euthyphro. I believe that's how you pronounce it. And we will pick it up there.